1862, Mississippi, a year drenched in war, pain, and silence. But hidden deep within those shadows lies a story that defies all logic. The unbelievable survival of a young slave boy, left for dead, yet destined to live. His name was lost to time, but his story was not. Host on camera, engaging tone. Hey everyone, welcome back to History Uncovered. Before we dive into this chilling mystery from the heart of the Civil War, tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? And don't forget to hit that subscribe button and ring the bell, because we put in days of research and verified historical digging to bring you real stories buried under centuries of dust. Your support helps keep true history alive. In the spring of 1862, the Mississippi Delta was a land of turmoil. The Civil War was tearing through the South. Plantations were crumbling under the pressure of war, and fear ran deeper than the muddy rivers that cut through the land. Among the countless plantations that dotted the region stood one known as the Fairchild Estate, an expanse of cotton fields stretching across several hundred acres near the Yazoo River. It was owned by a man named Silas Fairchild, a stern yet respected figure who, according to records and local accounts, kept strict control over both his land and the enslaved people who worked it. The war had already stripped him of several sons who had joined the Confederate Army, and rumors spread that his temper had grown even darker in their absence. But what truly set the Fairchild Estate apart was not its wealth or its cruelty. It was the strange and haunting story of one slave boy whose fate would later baffle historians. The boy, known only by his given name, Elias, was said to be about 12 years old at the time. Born on the plantation, he was quiet and observant, often helping in the stables and tending to the horses rather than working the fields. Those who recalled him described a child of rare composure for his age, someone who seemed to carry a deeper understanding of silence and survival. There were whispers among the enslaved community that Elias had been touched by spirits, not in a fearful way, but in the sense that he saw and felt things others did not. These superstitions were common in slave quarters, often rooted in ancestral beliefs carried from Africa, but in Elias's case, the belief would later seem prophetic. As Union troops advanced southward, fear spread through the region. Slaveholders worried about uprisings, escapes, and raids. One night in late summer, chaos erupted at Fairchild Estate. A small skirmish broke out nearby between Confederate scouts and Union soldiers, and in the confusion, fires spread to the plantation's outer buildings. When the smoke cleared, Elias was missing. His mother, a woman named Ruth, claimed to have last seen him near the stables, crying out for her as the flames grew higher. The next morning, a search was conducted, and what they found would be etched in plantation legend. Near the edge of the burned stables, they discovered a charred section of earth and the remains of a small frame. Bones that Silas Fairchild declared to be the boy's. Without hesitation, he ordered them buried in an unmarked grave behind the slave quarters, dismissing any further talk of the child. For everyone on the plantation, that was supposed to be the end of it, but it wasn't. Weeks later, long after the ashes had cooled and life returned to its grim routine, people began to whisper again. Strange noises came from the woods beyond the cotton fields, soft singing, almost like a lullaby. Some claimed they saw movement at night, a small figure walking near the river. Ruth refused to believe it, convinced that her boy was gone, but others swore Elias had somehow survived. One field hand, an older man named Hiram, later told his granddaughter that he saw Elias himself, pale, limping but alive, standing under a cypress tree by the riverbank. When he called out to him, the boy turned and vanished into the fog. Decades later, when the war had long ended and the plantation had fallen into ruin, explorers discovered fragments of burned wood, rusted tools, and the foundations of what had been the stables. But what truly puzzled them was a child's shoe, half buried near the river's edge, preserved far better than anything else in the area. No one could explain how it survived, or why it was found so far from where Elias was supposedly buried. Local historians tried to verify Fairchild's death records, but none existed for a boy named Elias. There were records of Ruth and Hiram, and even of Fairchild's family, but not a single trace of the child beyond oral accounts and letters that surfaced later. The plantation's story faded into folklore, but those who've studied the mystery believe the first clue to his survival lies in that vanished night, the fire, the confusion, and a boy whose disappearance would mark the beginning of a legend that refuses to die. The story of Elias should have ended with that unmarked grave, a quiet and unspoken tragedy buried under the weight of war. But as the months passed, the people around the Fairchild estate began to feel an unease that no one could fully explain. It started with small things: missing food from the smokehouse, faint footprints in the mud near the fields, and the eerie sense that someone was watching from the tree line at night. The slaves whispered among themselves that Elias had returned. They didn't mean it in a ghostly sense at first. Some believed he had escaped the fire and was living somewhere in the woods, surviving on whatever he could find. Others thought his spirit was restless, wandering the land in search of his mother. Either way, the line between life and death began to blur in the minds of those who still felt his presence. Ruth, his mother, had tried to bury her grief in silence. She had stopped speaking to most people, refusing to eat some nights, clutching the small wooden cross she had made for him. Then one evening, several weeks after his supposed death, she heard tapping on the back wall of her cabin, 3 soft knocks, slow and deliberate. When she stepped outside, she saw nothing but darkness. Yet when she looked down, she noticed a small piece of cloth, part of a torn shirt, that she recognized instantly as Elias's. It was dirty and singed at the edges, but it was his. She hid it in her apron and said nothing, but her heart began to believe what her mind could not. Her son might still be alive. The truth revealed itself in fragments through whispers and sightings. A few workers claimed they saw him near the old well, crouched low and silent, his face pale and gaunt, his eyes wide with fear. He didn't speak, they said, only stared for a moment before running back into the woods. Others thought they heard him crying at night, the sound carried across the cotton fields. The overseer, Mr. Gable, dismissed it all as nonsense. But one night, while doing his rounds, he saw something that made his blood run cold. Near the barn's edge, in the faint glow of the moon, stood a small figure. Gable raised his lantern and shouted, but the figure darted away too quickly, disappearing among the trees. The next morning, he found a small trail of blood near the barn door, and the clear imprint of a barefoot child in the mud. Silas Fairchild was furious. He accused the enslaved workers of hiding Elias, believing they were conspiring to protect an escaped slave. He ordered searches of every cabin and threatened punishment for anyone found helping him. But nothing was discovered. No one dared to admit they'd seen the boy, though many secretly left bits of food or scraps of cloth near the forest edge, hoping he would find them. They didn't see a runaway, they saw a miracle, a child who had walked through fire and somehow lived. Historians later speculated that Elias might have hidden in the swampy woods along the Yazoo River. a dense and treacherous place filled with snakes, insects, and thick fog that made pursuit nearly impossible. There were caves and hollowed trees, large enough for a child to crawl into, and stories of escaped slaves who had survived there for months, even years. What made Elias's survival so unbelievable was his age. Barely 12, alone, injured, and without shelter or tools. Yet the evidence suggests he endured the impossible. Months later, a Union scouting party passed through the area, and one soldier recorded in his journal an encounter with a small colored boy, weak and starving, who claimed to have escaped a burning plantation. The soldier didn't name the plantation, but his description matched Fairchild's land almost exactly. The entry ended abruptly, with no mention of what became of the boy. But it was enough to give historians pause. If that boy was Elias, it meant he had survived the fire, the forest, and even the wrath of Silas Fairchild himself. The mystery deepened when, after the war, letters surfaced from a Union camp in Tennessee mentioning a boy who could not die, a phrase repeated by more than one witness. Whether it was coincidence, legend, or truth, no one could say for certain. But those who knew the story of the Fairchild Plantation were convinced it was Elias, the boy who was buried but never dead, the child who defied fire, hunger, and fear. His survival was not just a miracle. It was a silent rebellion against a world that had tried to erase him. And for those who believed, it was proof that even in the darkest times, life could find a way to endure. After the rumors of Elias's survival began to spread beyond the Fairchild Plantation, fear and silence took hold of those who claimed to have seen him. In a time when speaking out could mean a death sentence, witnesses who might have revealed the truth simply disappeared or refused to speak at all. The South in 1862 was already drenched in superstition, and tales of the dead returning to life were dismissed as madness or blasphemy. Yet the accounts surrounding Elias were too specific, too consistent to ignore. Each story carried the same haunting details. A small boy, pale and limping, appearing near the edges of the plantation or along the river, always silent, always vanishing before anyone could approach. But as more people began to whisper of these sightings, those same witnesses began to vanish, or worse, meet strange fates. The first was Hiram, the elderly field hand who had claimed to see Elias by the riverbank. Not long after his account spread among the slaves, Hiram was found dead in his cabin, his face twisted as if from terror. The overseer said it was heart failure, but the others weren't convinced. They spoke in hushed tones about the curse of the boy who should have died. Some believed Elias's return had disturbed forces that should have remained at rest, and anyone who spoke of him too openly invited retribution. Whether by superstition or by deliberate silencing, the message was clear. Those who talked about Elias paid a price. The next to vanish was a young woman named Clara, who worked in the main house as a kitchen maid. She had been among the first to hear Elias's mother whisper that her boy was alive. Clara reportedly told another worker she'd seen a child's shadow pass by the window late one night, just before dawn. A few days later, she was gone. No one knew whether she escaped, was taken, or worse. Fairchild himself was furious, accusing Union spies of stealing his property. But others whispered that she had been taken by the same mysterious forces that protected Elias. Even the white residents of the area began to feel unease. A Confederate patrol passing through the district noted that Fairchild's workers refused to go near the river after sunset. Some claimed to hear a child's voice calling out faintly in the distance, singing what sounded like an old spiritual. The soldiers mocked the story at first, but two of them later reported seeing a figure in the woods, barely visible through the mist. One of those soldiers wrote a letter to his family weeks later, describing how the memory of that child's face haunted him. He never returned from the next battle. Over time, the fear spread beyond the plantation. Travelers along the Yazoo River told stories of a small boy wandering the banks at night. A trader passing through the area in 1863 recorded in his journal that he met a group of runaway slaves who spoke of the boy who walked through fire and did not burn. They said anyone who looked into his eyes saw something that froze their blood, something that made them remember every cruelty they had ever witnessed. Whether these were exaggerations or the result of collective trauma, no one could say. But what's certain is that by the end of the year, no one on or near the Fairchild property dared to mention Elias's name aloud. Ruth, the boy's mother, became the last living link to the story. She spoke rarely, but in one account later, written by a freedman's teacher after the war, she confessed that her son had come to her once, late one night. He stood in her doorway, weak and trembling, and whispered her name. She tried to hold him, but he backed away, saying only that he couldn't stay. When she woke the next morning, she found muddy footprints leading away from her cabin toward the river. She told no one until years later, when she was an old woman. By the time Union forces occupied the region in 1863, the plantation was half deserted. The overseer had fled. Fairchild himself had moved inland, and much of the enslaved community had vanished into freedom or hiding. But even the soldiers who took over the land refused to sleep in the cabins near the woods. They said it was cursed, that the trees whispered at night, and that a child's voice sometimes echoed across the fields. The witnesses who had once seen Elias were gone, silenced by fear, death, or time. Only fragments of their stories remained, half-remembered words, old letters, and trembling testimonies that all spoke of the same impossible truth, that a boy once buried had somehow walked among the living, and those who looked upon him could never again find peace. Years after the war had ended, and the Fairchild Plantation had become nothing more than overgrown ruins, a new piece of the mystery surfaced, one that gave the story of Elias an eerie second life. In 1888, more than 2 decades after the fire, a local historian named Samuel T. Reeves began collecting Civil War letters and documents from abandoned estates across Mississippi. His goal was to record the fading stories of the antebellum South before they were lost forever. Among the piles of yellowed papers and rusting keepsakes he found in an old chest from the Fairchild property were several letters written in a shaky hand, wrapped in oilcloth to protect them from moisture. The writing was uneven, the ink faint, and the tone of the words strange, almost desperate. These were not official correspondences. They were personal, raw, and filled with references to something that defied understanding. The letters were signed by Silas Fairchild himself. Most were addressed to his brother, a Confederate officer who had died before the war ended, meaning these letters were never sent. In one of them, dated late 1862, Silas wrote of the boy I buried, who now walks in the shadow of my land. He described sleepless nights, sounds at his window, and sightings of a child near the well. I see him as I saw him last, his skin burned and his eyes too calm, he wrote. If he lives, then the fire itself was a lie, and I am the fool of God. Reeves was stunned. The tone of the letter was one of both guilt and fear, as though Fairchild was confessing something beyond reason. In another letter, Fairchild mentioned that some of his remaining workers had fled, claiming to be haunted by the spirit of the boy. He wrote that he had ordered a second search of the gravesite. But when they dug up the spot where Elias was supposed to be buried, they found nothing. There was no body, he wrote, only ash and the remains of what looked like a cloth wrapping. The bones were gone. That discovery seemed to drive Fairchild to the brink of madness. Later entries hinted that he began hearing whispers whenever he walked near the burned stables, voices that repeated the boy's name over and over. He described dreams where the child stood at the foot of his bed, silent, his eyes reflecting firelight. But the letters didn't end there. Reeves found several written years later after the war, when Fairchild had reportedly moved north to live with distant relatives. Even then, the hauntings seemed to follow him. In a letter dated 1871, Fairchild wrote, "The child is not gone. I have seen him at the river's edge. Though this river is not the Yazoo, he does not age. He only watches." Whether this was a man's descent into guilt-fueled madness or something else entirely remains a mystery. Reeves tried to authenticate the letters by comparing handwriting and ink types, and his analysis confirmed they were genuine. But what baffled him most was one final item found in the same chest, a small water-stained note written in a different hand. It was shorter, less formal, and clearly written by someone with limited literacy. The note read, "Tell Mama I still walk by the water. I ain't cold no more." It was unsigned, but the handwriting appeared to belong to a child. Reeves believed it could have been written by Elias himself. The paper was dated months after the supposed fire. Over the next several years, the letters drew the attention of journalists, skeptics, and spiritualists. Some said the entire story was a hoax created by a guilt-ridden man. Others believed it was evidence of something supernatural, a soul too strong to be contained by death. But the letters didn't just deepen the mystery, they gave it credibility. Fairchild had nothing to gain from inventing such a tale. If anything, his words revealed the torment of a man haunted by something he couldn't explain or control. When Reeves's research was published in 1893, it caused a brief stir among historians and occultists alike. Visitors began traveling to the ruins of the old plantation, claiming to feel cold spots or hear faint voices near the riverbank. Some even said they saw the outline of a child walking through the fog. The letters were later stored in the Mississippi Historical Society archives, though several went missing during a fire in the 1920s. What remains are only fragments, enough to suggest that something extraordinary happened on that land. Whether it was the madness of guilt, a trick of the mind, or the persistence of a spirit that refused to rest, no one could ever prove. But the letters of Silas Fairchild stand as chilling evidence that the story of Elias did not end with his death. It continued to echo through the generations, as if written by the ghost of history itself. The story of Elias, the slave boy, who was said to have survived death, eventually turned into one of Mississippi's oldest unsolved mysteries. By the late 19th century, historians, ministers, and skeptics alike were all trying to make sense of what had truly happened on that cursed piece of land. But for every logical explanation that surfaced, another strange detail seemed to challenge it. What began as a story whispered in fear among the enslaved had evolved into a question that stretched beyond the boundaries of time and reason. Was Elias's survival a miracle, a myth born from trauma, or the result of something darker that history could never fully explain? As researchers dug deeper into the Fairchild records, they found inconsistencies that complicated everything. The plantation's birth and death records were incomplete, but a few surviving documents mentioned Ruth, Elias's mother. One note beside her name included the word "child missing." That alone was strange, because the other deceased were all listed with clear dates and causes of death. The absence of a record for Elias hinted that even Fairchild himself was uncertain of what had truly happened. There was also the soldier's journal entry from the Union camp, describing a small colored boy found wandering near the Yazoo, speaking little, bearing scars from burns. The soldier wrote that the boy should not have been alive, but he was too weak to travel with them, so they left him with locals who promised care. After that, no one ever found a trace of him again. This single line between life and death has continued to divide believers and skeptics. Some historians claim the boy in the Union soldier's account must have been someone else, another runaway who coincidentally matched the description. Others insist that the lack of a body at the Fairchild gravesite and the later discovery of the child's note found among Silas Fairchild's belongings were too precise to dismiss. If Elias truly survived, how had he done it? A child of 12, burned, starved, hunted, and alone in the Mississippi wilderness. How could he have lived long enough to be seen weeks or even months later? A few local scholars propose that Elias's survival was an exaggerated retelling of an escape story, a tale passed down through generations of freedmen that grew more supernatural with time. Trauma and hope, they said, could transform truth into legend. But others pointed to something stranger, accounts of other inexplicable recoveries during the same period. In nearby counties, there were stories of people buried too soon, only to awaken days later, their shallow graves disturbed by rain or animals. The Civil War era was rife with confusion, and medical knowledge was limited. It was possible that Elias had been unconscious, mistaken for dead, and somehow managed to crawl away once the fire died down. But this theory did not explain the later sightings that stretched years beyond the event, nor the reports that the boy looked exactly as he had in 1862, unchanged, untouched by time. Religious figures saw in Elias's story a symbol of divine mercy. Churches in the region used his tale as a parable of faith, calling him the boy God would not let die. They said his return was not a haunting but a message that even in the darkest corners of human cruelty, the hand of grace could still reach. Yet for every sermon praising the miracle, there were whispers among locals that something unnatural lingered along the Yazoo River. Farmers claimed their cattle refused to drink from certain spots, and fishermen said they heard soft humming near the cypress trees at dusk, a tune that no one could trace. Though it matched the lullaby Ruth was said to have sung to her son. In time, the story of Elias became both a warning and a mystery. The ruins of the Fairchild Plantation disappeared into the earth, but the legend lived on. Even today, some travelers claim to see a faint figure near the old river road when the mist rises, a small boy, barefoot, watching from the trees. Whether he was a miracle of endurance, a lost spirit searching for peace, or simply a myth born from sorrow, no one can say for certain. The truth remains trapped between worlds, much like Elias himself. He stands as a reminder that history doesn't always surrender its secrets, and sometimes the impossible survives not in flesh, but in the stories that refuse to die. The haunting question lingers more than a century later. Was Elias a child saved by fate, or a ghost that time forgot?